the idea that Canada has to participate in this atrocity is shocking, and it would shock Canadians if they were well aware of it.
We're going to have a complete destruction of a culture, of a people, and the East Timorese people will, disappear.
It's not the only place in the world where Canada is on the wrong side, but it's such an obvious issue of, our government is supporting the bad guys.
My name is Elaine Brière. I'm a photographer. Like many young people of my generation, I was backpacking around the world in the early 70s and attracted to places that were off the beaten path. Little did I realize at the time how this trip was to change my life. One of the first places I visited was East Timor, which is located between Australia and Indonesia. It was still a Portuguese colony when I first set foot on the shores of paradise in April of 1974. The rainy season had just ended. The countryside was dotted with delightful little villages, surrounded by gardens and jungle. It was idyllic, and the people showed a great respect for the natural environment. They were gracious and dignified, devoted to family and clan, kind and hospitable to strangers. 20 years ago, there were virtually no hotels in East Timor. We were adopted into a village after Fatima found us stranded on the beach one night after dark. Fatima was the village beauty. She was about 18 years old, the youngest daughter of elderly parents. She was of marriageable age and had many suitors. Like other village teenagers, she eagerly awaited the Sunday market when she could socialize away from the watchful eyes of her parents. The Sunday market was a pivotal event in East Timor in those days. People walked for many miles over mountain paths to sell, to barter, to meet relatives, to receive news, and to arrange their affairs.
In East Timor, you have about 17 or 18 ethno-linguistic groups, but they all actually lived in very similar ways. So you had society was that people and groups within that society had respect for one another, and there was mutual respect, but there was also mutual respect for the territory and the environment in which they lived. So it was a society in which people supported one another, cared very much for one another, and that enabled that society to remain fairly cohesive.
I wanted to go to East Timor because I heard it was relatively unaffected by European civilization. Later I learned that anthropologists from many countries came to East Timor to study its cultures, which were still intact. The Timorese organized themselves around the Kanua, the traditional village consisting of 20 or 25 families.
There was a leader in the Kanua, and there was a priest, traditional priest, who we call Dato. And those people who live in the Kanua, they know each other. And they help each other in every situation. And so people like to live in this environment. They don't feel they are alone in the village. They always have someone that can help and someone that can advise every hour and every day.
Sharing and cooperation were core values in Timorese society. Strong matriarchal traditions survived the Portuguese colonial period. Serious crimes such as murder and rape were virtually unknown. Every village had a spirit house for Mother Earth and another for Father Sky. One of my favorite memories of Timor is dozing off in the women's house to the sound of women chattering in the background and the little noises that babies make when they're nursing. The Timorese have a creation myth about a boy and a crocodile. The boy saved the crocodile's life. When the crocodile was old and going to die, he repaid the boy.
My body will become an island where your descendants will live forever. For the Timorese, crocodile is our grandfather.
Grandfather Crocodile protected the Timorese people for 2,000 years. But he was unable to save them from the terrible onslaught of the Indonesian invasion on December 7th, 1975. They attacked at dawn with a full air, naval, and overland assault. Back in Canada, as I heard fragments of news items, I felt a sickening sense of horror.
Radio messages received here tell of Indonesian warships bombarding Dili early this morning before paratroopers dropped in a circle around the city to be joined by troops ferried ashore later. A senior member of the left-wing Fretling movement said in his first message, "We need help. Paratroopers are dropping everywhere." At times, nearly hysterical, he said that women and children were being fired on and the Indonesians were killing indiscriminately.
Constancio Pinto was a child at the time of the Indonesian invasion. He became an important leader of the underground resistance. When he learned the military were looking for him, he escaped from East Timor in 1992 using a false passport.
I was 12 years old when Indonesia invaded the country. I joined my parents and we lived for 3 years in the jungle. In the jungle, we're suffering so many suffering, all kind of suffering, dying of starvation, dying of disease, and killing by Indonesian military. 1978 to 1979, it was a dramatic years for us. I saw with my eyes those who were killed in front of in front of me. Those husband and wife embrace each other and die. Every inches of places that we were hiding bombed. I would like to say that in one place called Matibian Mountain, they dropped 40 bombs a day. They also use napalm bomb, where the United States used in Vietnam War.
I was stunned by the horror of what I was hearing. I couldn't imagine why anyone would want to attack the Timorese people and disrupt their peaceful lives. I felt powerless to do anything. I had no idea why Indonesia wanted to take over East Timor.
There is a huge reserve of oil off the south coast of East Timor. The oil companies, particularly in Australia, were aware of this because they were negotiating also with the Portuguese long before the invasion. Australia decided very early on, even before the invasion, that they would favour Indonesia's takeover of East Timor because it would facilitate their aims to exploit the oil in the Timor Gap. It was just totally a pragmatic and totally immoral position to take on the question of East Timor. It was totally decided by the question of oil.
But there was essentially no reporting of it. I know that there are journalists in the United States who have done investigative reporting on Phillips Petroleum, the big American one, and their stories just get killed. They have so far not yet appeared. Australia recognized Indonesia was the only country to do it, only Western country to do it, very early, I think 1979, and the oil was the issue. There was almost no question about this. Then came various negotiations. In 1989, Australia and Indonesia signed a treaty to steal Timorese oil. Now, at the same time that they're robbing the oil under this outrageous treaty, the same governments are saying that East Timor can't be independent because it doesn't have resources.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, there's just no limits to cynicism.
Of course, I was expecting it to happen because the Indonesian troops had been carrying out incursions across the border, and we had reported a lot of this information in our publication.
Carmel Wijarjo spent 3 years in detention in Indonesia without trial after Suharto came to power. She says that the courage of the Timorese is what keeps her going.
In 1979, we've lost most of our people, almost 200,000 people. And many of the populations were forced to go to the village. In the village, people face another suffering. Killings, mass killings, rapes, and torture. People's faces were sliced with razor blades. Their fingernails pulled out, and their bodies were electric shock. And their ears were used as a stray. I myself, when I was arrested, I was tortured like that. Blood come out everywhere, my eyes, my nose, my mouth, and my ears, and it still beat me.
The song tells about human being and the wealth. If you lose your money or your gold, your wealth, you can have another time in the future. But if you lose somebody, he or she is gone forever. You cannot replace somebody with gold, with money. So the existence of a person is much more important than the money.
For years, I didn't understand why other countries weren't stepping in to help East Timor. Like many Canadians, I wasn't aware of the close connection between the Suharto regime and the government of Canada.
Through the early 70s, Canada got closer and closer to this government. In 1975, Suharto actually came to Ottawa. He had banquets and meetings and so on with Pierre Trudeau, who was the Prime Minister then. This was 6 months before the invasion of East Timor. East Timor was something that was being talked about at those meetings. There's very little doubt. The Canadian government knew what was going to happen, and they did nothing because they wanted to be friends with Suharto and with the Indonesian government. So they just sold out the principles that Canada says it stands for about being an international peacemaker. And they just sort of, I think, displayed the total moral hypocrisy of the Canadian government by going along with this and allowing these killings to go on and not saying a word.
When East Timor was invaded, an emergency vote was called in the United Nations condemning the invasion. Canada abstained. I was even more ashamed to be a Canadian when I learned that 2 years later, when the starvation policy of the Indonesian government was at its height, Glenn Shortliff, our ambassador to Indonesia, visited East Timor and reported that stories about naval bombardments, heavy artillery, etc., were patently false. I tried to ignore the madness. I didn't know that a few years before the invasion, the Canadian government backed one of the largest foreign investors in Indonesia with its financial support for Inco's giant nickel mine in Sulawesi.
It's all about money, and nothing about human life, and nothing about human rights. Money's the only thing that Canadian government and corporations seem to care about.
presence in the gallery today of His Excellency Dr. Mokhtar Kussumadamaja, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has allotted $300 million in aid through CETA to Indonesia over a 5-year period. How can this government continue to ignore the fact that Indonesia has invaded East Timor with 40,000 troops and is conducting Operation Extinction, which is tantamount to genocide?
At our suggestion, the Canadian ambassador in Indonesia was invited to visit East Timor to see conditions for himself. He believes that the arguments that have been made by various groups are exaggerated. I'm sure that I speak for the government of Indonesia in indicating that they would be prepared to welcome the honourable member to come and see for himself.
Is the minister saying, Mr. Speaker, that he has received from the Foreign Minister of Indonesia and from our ambassador in Indonesia and other sources sufficient evidence that the military occupation of East Timor has come to an end?
In a word, Mr. Speaker, yes.
Foreign powers, which have important economic relations with Indonesia, really don't care about what's happening in East Timor, and it reinforces Indonesia's determination just to continue its occupation of East Timor, because they know very well that countries like Canada will not rebuke Indonesia and will not punish Indonesia for its activities in East Timor. So it is an encouragement to the Indonesians in carrying on in East Timor just the same as ever. We are getting reports all the time, not only of killings, arrests, detentions, torture, the raping of women, the breakup of families, thousands of orphans. The situation in East Timor is, as a society, has been devastated by the Indonesian invasion.
The faces of the people I had met during my brief stay in East Timor haunted me. I wondered what had become of Fatima, of Mama and Papa, and Luis. I found myself becoming an activist. I made contact with other people who cared about what was happening in East Timor. I began to make a photo documentary of the East Timor Solidarity Movement. I started to give slideshows in church basements and college campuses. I wrote articles. I discovered that my photographs of East Timor were the last documentation of village life taken before the Indonesian invasion. Maureen Davies, Derek Evans, and I started the East Timor Alert Network. The Canadian Council of Churches sent me to the decolonization hearings on East Timor at the United Nations. Suddenly, I was giving my simple speech about my travels in East Timor alongside seasoned members of the human rights community, such as Pat Walsh from the Australian Council for Overseas Aid and Lord Avebury, chair of the London Parliamentary Human Rights Group. My nervousness was soon dispelled. They welcomed me and were delighted to see a Canadian, any Canadian, turn up at the United Nations and support East Timor. From these people, I learned that the Suharto regime was keeping East Timor completely cut off from the outside world. I realized that it was only the Solidarity Movement that was keeping the issue alive in the Western countries. I found the courage and the inspiration I needed to go back to Canada and redouble my efforts for East Timor.
Indonesia is peculiar in the modern world today because the very people who perpetrated these atrocities are now the ones in power. They are the ones who are creating the history and who are creating the terms of reference, which for very opportunistic reasons, much of the world community has chosen to accept. If, for example, Hitler had won the Second World War, the atrocities perpetrated against minorities and against Jews in particular throughout the lead up to the Second World War would somehow not be known, would be repressed by a regime which was dominated by the successors of Hitler.
Gradually, I was learning more about the Suharto regime from human rights publications, a source of information routinely ignored by the mainstream media.
Yeah, the media coverage, I think, has been appalling. And in 1978, when there were huge pitched battles in East Timor, bloodbaths going on, thousands of people being killed every day in the encirclement campaigns in the mountains of East Timor, that's when the coverage in the Globe and Mail fell to zero.
Elaine Brière of the East Timor Alert Network says the media, including As It Happens, are ignoring the Canadian angle in this story, the fact that Canada supports Indonesia despite Indonesia's aggression in East Timor. Wouldn't your audience be interested in hearing Canada's human rights policy in this matter debated?
I'm not sure. We've tried to get an assessment of how interested or how connected. Interested is not the right word, but that connection and that relation. How strong that is, and it just doesn't seem strong enough that people are going to stay with us while we follow that.
So it just isn't a story. There aren't enough people interested in it for you to cover it.
They're not, I don't know, but if interest is the right word, there's that connection where it resonates and says something so that all the way through the story while you tell it, they're following you and are connected to it.
But it's a fascinating story of invasion and genocide and allegations of repression and resistance. Don't those qualify? Don't those fit the criteria?
Those don't add up to. Those are different from how people connect to it.
But As It Happens does frog jumping and who can spit the farthest and
we think when we do those stories that there's a way in which the people who listen to our show connect to it, relate to it, will follow us as we tell it.
But not East Timor.
Not in the way we've been able to assess it so far.
Look, the press is not in the business of letting people know how power works, and it would be crazy to expect them to be. They're part of the power system. Why should they expose it?
Noam Chomsky has been calling the world's attention to the plight of the East Timorese ever since the invasion.
There's all sorts of filtering devices that they actually start in kindergarten and they go all the way up through professions, which simply basically filter for conformity and obedience. I think every one of us who's been to a good university can find plenty of examples in our own history.
It was disappointing to discover that many Canadian universities and colleges were receiving large grants to work on development projects in Indonesia. Only one such institution, the University of Guelph, has held an external review on the ethical consequences of giving aid to the Suharto regime. Suharto quickly terminated the $30 million Guelph project in Sulawesi over what he considered interference in the internal affairs of Indonesia. Since 1987, Simon Fraser University has accepted two $20 million grants to deliver science education in eastern Indonesia. The money comes from the Canadian International Development Agency, and the justification for taking the money comes from the professors hired by the project.
We're talking about the upgrading of science to even perhaps the second-year university level, so that these people who have in these universities that we're teaching in, faculties of engineering and forestry and agriculture and fisheries, they have those faculties, but if you take a forestry faculty, they don't know how the trees photosynthesize. So their basic understanding of science is thin. That has to be upgraded so that they themselves are better placed for their own communities to be involved in health and education matters in a better way, to help in resource management, to help in environmental management, to help even in the industrial and infrastructure.
The respectable intellectual community on every issue, not just this one, is supportive of power, and it's not very surprising.
many Canadian academics feel that it is acceptable simply to have no comment on the human rights situation and the conditions of political repression in Indonesia. But through their silence, Canadian academics actually share complicity in the kinds of atrocities that have continued now for 30 years.
Like some in the academic community, a powerful sector of the business community has its own incentives for remaining silent. There are a complex array of government services and startup funds available for corporations wanting to invest or sell their products in Indonesia.
From our perspective as a small business going into Indonesia and establishing ourselves, we couldn't have done it without the Canadian government's assistance. They have good relationships between the ambassador and the commercial people to provide support to whatever particular venture. If you're looking at putting a proposal in, then they'll actually support that proposal and go to meetings with you.
Our embassy is very trade-oriented. The trade section of the embassy will help you with individual programs, and then you will make your own decision whether Indonesia is a market that you need to pay attention to.
It's a very fast-growing country, a very fast-growing economy. They are very receptive to foreigners, unlike some areas in Asia. They like North Americans, particularly Canadians. Once you become adapted culturally, it's relatively easy to do business.
The World Bank's comments about the liberal market that Indonesia is, I think, are right on the money. You know, they've got the same amount of office space in Jakarta that they do in the downtown Vancouver. That's maybe not a big surprise. But if I told you that they're building, you know, almost 9 million more square feet currently, that's a big surprise, because that's probably more office space that's being built in all of Canada. And if that doesn't signal growth and opportunity, then you've got to be pretty naive.
Indonesia is the key to Southeast Asia. It's by far the largest country and the largest economy in Southeast Asia. It's potentially one of the major economies of the world. Indonesia is a country of about 195 million people. It's the 4th most populous country in the world, and it's a country that has a very rich endowment of natural resources. Obviously, it has a very large workforce. It also, therefore, has a very large potential consumer market.
But when I asked these same businessmen about East Timor, they were much less knowledgeable or sympathetic.
I'd have to literally go down and talk to some East Timorese to understand their reluctance to be a part of Indonesia, because to me, Indonesia, again, is a very dynamic, progressive country that's moving out of the colonial era.
The human rights situation is something that does get a lot of bad press. And everybody on planet Earth is familiar with East Timor, but I don't know how many people know about East Timor, and I don't suppose to be one of those people either.
East Timor, to me, is still it's something that I read about in the media, and we in our company don't have any direct experience to be able to relate to it, to say good, bad, or indifferent.
If a little tiny country that's really no harm to anybody has to be denied its rights just so business interests of the world can feel more comfortable, what would you say to that?
That's the way the world is.
If a business person, a Canadian business person, says, I don't care at all about human rights, fair enough, okay? That's their prerogative. If they wish to go on record saying that they don't care about people being killed and tortured and so on, well, that's fine. They are operating in a completely amoral environment, and that's up to them. If, however, they say they do care but they can't do anything about it, then I call them a liar, because it's precisely the business people who can make a point, who can be listened to because of the importance of investment to the Indonesian economy.
Everybody except maybe Portugal would really like the situation to go away. I think the rest of the world pretty much accepts that there's no prospect of there being an independent East Timor, that the best resolution for the problem would be for
the Timorese to go quietly.
Dili, the capital of East Timor, has become a boom town. Construction by rich Indonesians and the Indonesian government is everywhere. Still, Timorese risk speaking out.
You know that there is development, material development, but sometimes the people ask, development for whom? If we are not happy, we live under pressure and sometimes oppression.
There is some reluctance by foreign corporations to set up shop in a town where there is often a 7 o'clock curfew and death squads roam the streets at night. But not enough to prevent Bata Shoes, a Canadian corporation, from opening up a retail store.
You know that by night the people here in Dili, they don't sleep in peace, in tranquility. They are still awake because there are groups of ninja. How do you say ninja in English? From the securities, and then they go around to provoke the young people, and then they beat them.
I'm here because the Indonesians sent me from East Timor as a deputy to say everything's how wonderful Indonesian, and ask the Canadian to come to visit Indonesian, to spend a lot of money in Indonesian, that Indonesian have a lot of potential. Tourism, everything's fine. Everything's wonderful in Indonesia. Canadian government have a relationship with Indonesian, have a business, everything's nice with Indonesian.
I first met Isabel Gallos in October 1994. She was 21 years old when she defected from a Canada World Youth Exchange program with Indonesia. She lived with me while she applied for refugee status in Canada.
Indonesian government, Indonesian military, they never want Timorese. They want our land, they want our resources, and they want everything that we have. They never want Timorese. They knew that we are small population, that they want to kill all of us, and they just take over our country.
In some ways, she reminded me of Fatima. I never found out if Fatima survived. She might have had a daughter like Bella, a daughter who had no memory of the peaceful society that once existed, only of life under the Indonesian occupation.
In my life, I pretend. And every Timorese, we know how to pretend, how to act Indonesian. If you didn't know how to act Indonesian, the same way you kill yourself. You never have a life. I never can talk in my country. And then they came to every high school. They gave us sterilization. We didn't know what is this. We didn't know before everything like this. And they just gave us a sterilization, they injected us. And this not just happened for a young woman, include married women. They didn't want East Timorese to have more population. Before the invasion, Timorese, we were 700,000 population. But after the invasion, there's 500,000 Timorese right now.
East Timorese resistance to the Indonesian occupation is something quite stunning and phenomenal. They have never, throughout the whole period since 1975, given up their struggle. They have gone through the most devastating destruction of their lives, their culture. They have been forced into strategic villages, living in the most appalling conditions. Their capacity to grow food has been effectively destroyed. Their whole culture has been destroyed, and yet never for a minute have they given up the struggle against the Indonesians.
When the Indonesians invaded, they really thought that they would take over the territory and it would all be over in about 3 or 4 months, and lots of Western governments thought that too. But that's because they didn't understand the strength of Timorese feeling to be independent and the strength and the ability of Timorese living in different areas of the country to work together.
In November of 1991, several journalists entered East Timor as tourists to wait for a Portuguese delegation, which never came. The Timorese took this opportunity to stage a pro-independence demonstration. Later that day, at a memorial service at the Santa Cruz Cemetery, Indonesian soldiers opened fire. Nearly 300 people were killed that day. The bodies were buried in mass graves. The only remains ever to be returned were those of Kamal Bamahaj, a 21-year-old university student from Australia. He had gone to East Timor to do translation for the Australian journalists.
Timorese just want freedom because we have our own culture. We have our own languages and histories. It's very different with Indonesian. It's very far away, very different. But Indonesian, they said, East Timor is part of Indonesia. And they try to kill people who try to create demonstration. They always kill people who want to say what the Timorese want. Better that I die to get this freedom, to get this independence, better than have to just sit down and wait for killing.
A year after the Dili massacre, Shanana Gusmao, the charismatic leader of the Timorese resistance, was captured by the Indonesians and sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Whatever the extent of the continuing military repression, there is a quieter invasion of East Timor that's causing its own measure of civil unrest. Since Indonesia opened up its 27th province in 1989, migrants from elsewhere in Indonesia have come in their tens of thousands, now forming about 10% of the population. This village is a direct transplant from Sulawesi. This man, a Sulawesi, is not only fishing in Timorese waters, he has a job in the Timorese public service. Meanwhile, many locals are unemployed.
Well, the effect of the invasion on the subsistence economy has been really to massively undermine it. And the Indonesians took the most fertile areas and used those to grow cash crops, which were then exported either outside Indonesia or to other parts of the archipelago, the Indonesian archipelago. So economically, the society has been completely undermined. A lot of ethno-linguistic groups have disappeared.
In Indonesia itself, there are no basic human rights. The military dominate every aspect of civilian life. The population is obliged to attend military parades and frequent flag raisings. Arrests for even minor offenses, such as possessing a banned book, are frequent. Today, nearly everyone in Java has a friend or relative who has been in prison. Independent associations, such as trade unions, are not permitted.
Many times the military treat me to should die, but I am a Christian. I believe that my soul and my breath depend on to the God, even though the military shoot me, and let me say, and the bullets from my stomach and out from back. But if the God say Mokhtar didn't die yet, I will not die.
Shortly after his return from Canada, Mokhtar was arrested and charged with subversion. If convicted, Mokhtar would likely face a lengthy jail sentence or even death.
One of the conspicuous causes of serious human rights violations and acts of repression in Indonesia today is the fact that the government wishes to maintain one of the cheapest, most docile, in their terms, sources of labor in the entire Asia-Pacific region. They proudly announce that their labor is orderly, is cheap, much cheaper than the labor in many other parts of the world.
We have 189 million people. That makes a huge emerging market, and at the same time we can provide good competitive labor. because our labor at the moment will cost you about 26 cents US dollar per hour, and it is an incredible low labor rates.
Minister, I do have just a question about East Timor, which I think we should ask you about, if only because it's a question which is quite often raised.
Well, since we consider East Timor as one of our provinces, then we are going to develop the area like we're developing the rest of the areas. The people of East Timor wanted so much to integrate with us. It's not us who wants it, but the people of the East Timor wants to integrate with us.
Why won't Indonesia hold a referendum in East Timor?
Well,
What's the Timorese want?
I think you better ask our foreign ministers in next door. I'm not in a position to answer that.
I think that's a very fair answer, because this is an investment seminar, and maybe a quick trip across the Pan-Pacific will get a good answer. Thank you.
So I went next door to the Pan-Pacific Hotel. Andre Roulette, our Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, was hosting a trade conference. All the Pacific Rim delegates were there, including Ali Alatas, Foreign Minister for Indonesia. It was a photo op only, no questions allowed. Although the business community was always willing to talk to me, provided we skirted the issue of East Timor, both Indonesian and Canadian ministers of foreign affairs refused to be interviewed. In frustration, I traveled to Ottawa to try and get an interview with Andre Roulette. The closest I got was a press scrum on Parliament Hill. That's what we're really prepared to talk about today. Could you tell us anything about what Canada's going to do to help East Timor? Mr. Roulette, what is Canada going to do to help East Timor?
I'm sorry, I have. This is not on the agenda today.
Can I ask you about the fish negotiations and what's happening there? I mean,
I'd just like to ask when we're going to endorse the UN resolutions on East Timor that have been standing for 20 years and never. There have been many times when I found it difficult to continue. Fatigue, illness, and financial hardship made me wonder how long I could keep on doing this work. But in the last 5 years, I've seen a lot of change. The East Timor Alert Network now has 12 chapters and over 3,000 members. Many groups, including unions and students, have put East Timor on their agenda. It's their energy and commitment that keeps me going.
Free East Timor, long live democracy, and down Suharto. Thank you. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
Stop the aid, stop the trade, stop the genocide. Stop the aid, stop the trade, stop the genocide. Stop the aid, stop the trade, stop the genocide.
These ill-bred people have to be shot, and we will shoot them.
People always say, well, how do you keep going on an issue like this, which is so far away? Well, if the Timorese can keep going for 17 years, then I don't think it's very difficult for Canadians to write a letter or to speak out, because they've been living under a kind of terror that we know nothing of.
Why is it that we are subsidizing with incentives, with grants, with very lucrative financial inducements some of the wealthiest corporations in Canada to invest in a ruthless and repressive regime in Indonesia, at the same time as we're cutting back on basic social programs in this country? We're cutting back on health care, on post-secondary education, on basic social assistance.
We're giving aid to Indonesia. I don't think we should be given aid to Indonesia. We shouldn't allow companies like Inco to transfer jobs there.
Even though there are a lot more people speaking out, every July the World Bank Consortium on Indonesia meets with its Western donors, including Canada, to give the Suharto regime several $billion in new aid money.
I'm reminded by a statement made by the director of the World Bank responsible for Indonesia. He said, "You should reflect upon how Indonesia has managed its economy, its society for the past 25 years, and take that as a sign of hope that wise minds will manage the next 25 years." I fully subscribe to that sentiment.
You know, the development aid didn't reach the people, 40 up to 50%. By the officers, and the fraud to be used to practice human rights violation, anti-democratization process, and anti-rule of law.
This is an authoritarian regime. Giving it money in whatever guise, in whatever form, is a dangerous prospect. I think Canadians who argue otherwise are either being willfully blind or they're being dreadfully naive.
The famous Canadian diplomat, I think his name was John Hughes, who once said, he described what he called the Canadian idea. He said the Canadian idea is to stand up for your ideals and find a way around them.
And it would seem to me that Canada, the Canadian government, should rebuke the Indonesian government very, very strongly for what they have done in East Timor, and incidentally also for what they do to their own people in Indonesia itself. An action like this would have a very powerful effect on the Indonesian regime.
Nevertheless, Canada continues to build close relationships with the Suharto regime.
We also share a commitment to celebrating our multicultural and multilingual diversity.
In January of 1996, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, 6 provincial premiers, and 300 business executives went to Indonesia to seek new contracts and trade deals. They came back jubilant. Over $2.7 billion in new contracts were signed, bringing Canadian investment in Indonesia close to $9 billion.
2 visits by a prime minister in 14 months does wonders to move files, does wonders to push the bureaucracy, not just in Jakarta, but in Ottawa as well, to get things through the system, and it encourages the business community to take advantage, to ride the crest of a wave of very positive public opinion.
H.A. Simons Engineering of Vancouver is constructing a pulp mill in eastern Borneo, renamed Kalimantan by the Indonesians. Borneo is home to the last wild orangutans, whose habitat is being rapidly destroyed by logging and giant plantation schemes funded by the World Bank. At least 16 new pulp mills are due to start operating in the next 7 years.
It is a rather undeveloped area of Kalimantan I went to by a microscopic plane onto a boat up a jungle river, and there I found 100 Canadians, I underline 100 Canadians, who were carving a pulp mill out of this remote area.
In February of 1996, Brière Minerals of Calgary struck gold in Kalimantan. Shares skyrocketed overnight. Since 1968, Inco Limited of Toronto has invested over $2 billion in its nickel mine in southern Sulawesi. At the same time, the company has been downsizing its Canadian operations.
Over 50% of all the new applications for contracts of work in mining are Canadian. Not Australian, not Japanese, not American, not European. They are Canadian. It's not just Brière, it's a multitude of Canadian companies that are looking at how to find their niche in the very rich mineral deposits of that country.
In addition to resource extraction, the Canadian government has long encouraged the sale of military equipment and technology to Indonesia. Today, the Suharto dynasty is worth $70 billion. In In its 1995 report, Transparency International named Indonesia as the most corrupt country in the world, but some people still call it paradise.
Yeah, paradise only investors, for conglomerates, for the officers, for military, not for the people. Maybe the government here and the conglomerates here or the capitalists here didn't care about that. Of course, I know it, because their interest only how to exploit our natural resources. I think it is the mission of Canada government and the employers here. But I will say, do not come to Indonesia if only to exploit our economy, but give your attention also to social justice, to democratization, to the people there, to the human rights.
The Canadian government has yet to condemn the invasion of East Timor. Indonesia wouldn't be in East Timor if it weren't for the collaboration between Western leaders and a corrupt military elite. A collaboration in a race to drain the archipelago of its resources as quickly as possible. Peoples like the Timorese stand in the way of this ruthless search for raw materials and new markets. It's taken more than 20 years, but at last the media is beginning to cover the occupation of East Timor, as well as the lack of human rights in Indonesia. In 1996, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to José Ramos Horta and Bishop Ximenes Bello for their outspoken defense of the right of the Timorese people to self-determination. The Timorese people have many strong beliefs. They believe that the spirits of the dead go into the trees and the animals and never really leave them. They believe that Mother Earth and Father Sky will come to live in the villages again when East Timor is free. They believe that the world will not abandon them to the Indonesians. This documentary is dedicated to the people of East Timor, to Shanana Guzmao, and to all those who have given their lives to the cause of freedom in East Timor.
Right up the baby.